I've already talked about a few games based on the original Yu-Gi-Oh series that I grew up with, and a few people have been asking me what I thought of the other Yu-Gi-Oh series. I didn't see many episodes of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX because I didn't have cable when it was on, and when 4Kids started showing episodes of it, they only showed the last dozen or so episodes of the series, and then the first 4 episodes of the series. I may not be qualified to judge the series, but what little I saw didn't impress me. It seemed to me that the show didn't have a continuous story, and when it did, it had a story that was stupid. Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's, on the other hand, I thought was a real return to form for the series, and of the 1.5 seasons that I got to see, I thought it was really good. Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's takes place about 20 years after the original series. Domino City, where the Battle City tournament took place, has been split in half by a catastrophic earthquake. Normal citizens live in the high-tech Neo-Domino City, and lower-class citizens live in the Satellite, a run-down shithole where citizens have no rights whatsoever and work in trash and recycle centers under the oppressive rule of the corrupt police force. The protagonist of this series is Yusei, a duelist who escapes the Satellite to crusade for satellite freedom and to get revenge on his one-time friend Jack Atlas, who took Yusei's best card and fled the Satellite and is now the greatest duelist in the world. However, Yusei soon discovers that he and Jack are both signers, duelists imbued with magic powers involving an ancient godlike being called the Crimson Dragon, and thus Yusei is soon fighting various villains who want to take over the world. The 5D's series added 2 things to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Series. First, it introduced tuner and synchro monsters, where you send a tuner and a non-tuner monster from your field to the graveyard to summon a synchro monster from your fusion deck, hitherto known as the extra deck. The second thing it added was turbo dueling, where 2 duelists battle it out while riding on high-speed vehicles called duel runners. Come to think of it, the 2 shows that I watched at 4Kids at this time were Kamen Rider Dragon Knight and Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's, and both involve cards and motorcycles. Weird. We all know that, aside from a frequently insignificant rule change, turbo dueling was just regular dueling that was made a little more exciting to watch, but you can't deny that if you watched Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's, one thought crossed your mind: turbo dueling looks fun as hell! So Konami made a turbo dueling video game, Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's Wheelie Breakers, on the Nintendo Wii. The game has 3 gameplay modes: a story mode, Grand Prix mode, and matchup mode, which is kind of a free play and multiplayer mode. The story mode pretty much follows the story of the series, with you taking the place of Yusei. You play as a satellite citizen who enters a turbo dueling tournament in the city, satellite citizens being allowed to enter since Yusei won the Fortune Cup. Oh yeah, spoiler warning for the first season of the show, the good guy wins. The story mode is a series of 8 one-on-one fights leading up to a showdown with Yusei for the Wheelie Breakers Championship. If you play through the story mode a second time, half of the opponents change, and Jack is the final boss instead of Yusei, so you pretty much get to fight every enemy in the game one-on-one. And want to hear something that will blow your mind? The friend that supports you throughout the game is Rally, one of Yusei's friends from the Satellite. Rally wears this dress all the time, has really long hair, and is voiced by the same voice actress who voiced Luffy in the 4Kids version of One Piece. Rally is a guy. I am dead serious. Although the fact that he's in a Yu-Gi-Oh! Series and he doesn't have boobs the size of watermelons probably should have been my first clue. Wheelie Breakers is actually a racing game instead of a dueling game. Well, actually it's kind of both, but we'll get to that later. You build a deck of 15 to 25 cards to use while you race. You draw cards from your deck, summoning monsters to attack other racers, using spells to buff yourself or to inflict ailments on your opponents, and using traps that activate when other racers try to screw with you. I guess the best way to describe the game is imagine Mario Kart where you get to select which items you get before the race starts. The gameplay of Wheelie Breakers is actually really complicated to explain, but it's really simple to get the hang of once you start playing. As you drive, you gain speed counters, which the game calls D counters, and you're allowed to have up to 12 at one time. You use these counters to summon monsters and have your monsters attack. The stronger a monster is, the more counters it costs to summon an attack. Each monster has a certain number of hit points, enhances your vehicle's performance while summoned, and has its own unique attack. Some of them fire projectiles while others have explosive or trap attacks. When you get hit by an enemy's monster, your monster loses hit points and a monster dies when its hit points hit 0. If you get hit by an attack without a monster on the field, the monster's attack points come out of your life points. If your life points hit 0, your runner breaks down and you're left motionless for a few seconds, which makes keeping a monster on the field really damn important. You're also only allowed to have one monster summoned at a time, which I found out the hard way when I summoned Junk Warrior during my first race, decided to fortify my defenses with a Sonic Chick, then watched in horror as Junk Warrior, the Titan that I think is one of the best monsters in the game, disappeared and Sonic Chick, a puny monster whose only upside is blocking attacks, took his place. Wheelie Breakers is one of those rare racing games that incorporates items into the racing game without breaking the racing game, and it's all because the game is as much about fighting the other players as it is about racing them. Running out of cards is a death sentence because no monsters means nothing to protect you from enemy attacks, which means you break down every couple of seconds. You also want to attack enemies as much as possible to break them down and to destroy as many of their monsters as possible so they have fewer weapons to attack you with. There's lots of strategy that goes into selecting the cards you use for a race and how you use them during the race. You only got 25 cards and you're allowed 3 copies of each card in your deck, and every single card that you pick takes up valuable space in your deck. Which monsters do you use? Do you use low-level monsters with low attack costs so that you can dish out damage quickly, or do you go for stronger monsters with higher costs but much better and more accurate attacks? Some monsters attack by placing barricades that slow down opponents, but those are only useful if you're winning, so is it worth having them on hand or is that space in your deck better used elsewhere? And then there's your spells and traps. How many turbo boost cards do you use? Do you focus on drawing cards, inflicting effect damage, keeping your speed counters high, screwing with your opponent's hands? There are only 125 cards in the game, but they all have great uses, and you have to put serious thought into which cards deserve a spot in your deck. Wheelie Breakers really is a fresh new take on racing games, and I think it's all because this is one of the few racing games where you actually interact with the other racers. In most racing games, the other players are only there to force you to finish within a certain time limit. Other racing games like Mario Kart include items so that you can hinder other racers, but you don't really interact with other racers in those games. You just lob something in their general direction. Also, on the topic of Mario Kart, racing games that include items tend to become completely broken because you can be about to cross the finish line, get hit by an unavoidable blue shell, and lose, and there's nothing you can do about it. Wheelie Breakers is nothing like that. You're downright brawling with the other competitors as you race. You're attacking enemies not only to make enemies wipe out, but to demolish as many of their monsters as possible. You're hurling attacks at other racers. You're summoning monsters to both arm yourself with weapons and to protect yourself from enemies. If another racer takes the lead, you don't just race really well, and maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to get back ahead. You shoot that asshole! It's driving and managing an arsenal of cards at the same time, and it is so damn much fun once you get the hang of it. It's almost like a cartoon version of Death Race. Granted, I've never seen Death Race, but I can still reference it, right? Also, unlike so many racing games like that abomination Sonic Riders, the AI isn't a cheating bastard. They're just regular enemies with the same cards you have. Once you play for a long time anyway. The game has 125 cards, and you have to play extensively to unlock them all. And since the best cards in the game, like Synchro Blast Wave, take forever to unlock, it's a very effective way to keep you playing the game. The controls are pretty intuitive too. You use the control stick to steer, the Z and C buttons to brake and accelerate, and you use the control pad to navigate and use the cards in your hand. It's kind of like driving with one hand and using cards with the other. The game, of course, has an obligatory Wii Remote motion control, so you fling the Wii Remote to start driving backwards so that you can attack racers behind you, which is a pretty neat mechanic. I just like the physics this game operates on, where you can go from driving forward at 70 miles per hour or so and pull a 180 and start driving backwards without any deceleration, when in reality your vehicle would have to grind its wheels to a halt and start accelerating in reverse to pull that off. The story mode is a series of 8 one-on-one races against the game's different enemies. The story mode battles have a lot of rubber banding where the player that is behind gets a speed boost, and this leads to very funny moments where you pull ahead of your opponent, then your opponent pulls ahead of you, and so on and so forth. And the rubber banding basically means that story mode enemies are still a challenge for you once you've beaten the main campaign and your runner has been upgraded.
And our challenger has just destroyed a monster!
Okay, what's up with the announcer that has hair that's shaped like a penis? The story mode is meant to evoke actual dueling, a one-on-one contest where it's everything you have versus everything your opponent has, may the best man win, and it's pretty fun and simple. The Grand Prix mode, on the other hand, is insane! If the story mode is meant to resemble a traditional one-on-one duel, then imagine the Grand Prix mode being an 8-way duel where 8 racers are duking it out all the same time. It's chaos! The Grand Prix mode has 4 cups, and each is more frantic than the last. There are 7 other racers summoning monsters and hurling Hadoukens the entire race in a frantic struggle for first place. You've got racers ahead of you that you're trying to attack and pass, you've got racers behind you that are trying to take you down, all while managing your cards and monitoring your monsters. It's the most frantic racing game I've ever played, and I love every minute of it. Each Grand Prix is 5 or 6 races long, and some of the races are survival battles, where a racer is eliminated from the race once their life points hit 0, and I really like the survival battles. It really steps up the pressure and makes racing even more intense, and it's more satisfying to beat up an enemy when there are more, shall we say, permanent consequences. Plus, the survival battles are a great way to make up some distance in the Grand Prix rankings. Oh, Jack won the first round and he has more points in the standings than you. Kamehameha! Last place, asshole! I really hate Luna though when it comes to survival races because her deck has so many cards that replenish her life points that they frequently cap off at 9,999. Such a pain in the ass. And when I was recording footage for this review, a survival race in the Grand Prix came down to just me and Greiger in the third lap, and right before Greiger crossed the finish line, my Junk Warrior decked him and he ran out of life points right before he could cross the finish line and I won. It was awesome.
You finished! And a victory like this is surely one for the record books.
One of the things that I really respect about Wheelie Breakers is that it's one of the rare games in this day and age that has the balls to be hard. And I mean hard. The first opponent that you race in the story is some random hoodlum. No, really, his name is Hoodlum. He's slower than you and his monsters have a lousy range to their attacks, so he's easy to beat and you can get used to the controls while you're fighting him. The second opponent is Leo, who doesn't have any great monsters and just mildly annoying spells and traps, and the third opponent is Chief Armstrong, who's slow as crap. But from the fourth story mode fight on, the game is mercilessly hard. The fourth story mode duelist is Officer Trudge, and on your first run through the story mode, not only is he faster than you, but his favorite monster is Goyo Guardian, an extremely powerful monster that increases his racer's acceleration as long as it's on the field. Basically, if you don't kill all three of Trudge's Goyo Guardians as soon as each one hits the field, he will quickly get so far ahead that it becomes physically impossible to catch up to him. And don't get me started on the next story mode opponent, Akiza, who uses cards that destroy your traps, uses traps that shuffle monsters back into your deck, uses copy plants to cover the road with traps that slow you down, and her Black Rose Dragon fires blasts that take up over half the road. And it only gets worse from there. Trudge and Akiza eventually get easier as you get further into the game and get better cards, but Yusei and Jack are hard no matter what cards you have, especially since you fight each of them on a short course and you have 2.5 minutes at best to beat them. And trust me, the Grand Prix are hard as hell too. The Bronze and Silver Cups are pretty easy, but the Gold Cup is a huge difficulty spike. The Gold Cup pits you against Yusei, Jack, and Akiza all at the same time, so there are 3 Signer Dragons on the field firing massive blasts across the entire track all the damn time. And that's before Jack busts out his End of the Storm cards, which destroy all monsters on the field when activated. And the Platinum Cup goes from just being hard to being ludicrous, because Lazar joins the Platinum Cup and his deck is full of cards that force you to discard from your hand. Have fun restarting each race 3 dozen times because you keep running out of cards! But if it sounds like I'm complaining, I'm actually not. Wheelie Breakers pisses you off in a good way. It makes you just enraged enough so that you want to keep playing the game because you want to teach the game a lesson, damn it! The game is hard, but it's never unfairly hard, and I'm glad that a game released in this day and age still has the balls to be difficult, and be difficult on purpose rather than just be difficult because it was designed poorly. Besides, the difficulty is really reduced by the fact that you have the option to restart any race as many times as you want, because this is a Yu-Gi-Oh game and sometimes you just have bad luck. But even though the difficulty isn't a problem with this game, the game does have some big problems, and I have to play bad cop in these reviews, so bitch mode, activate! It's kind of like assault mode activate, except more bitching. The game just flat out doesn't tell you several pieces of information about your monsters. There's nowhere that you can look up how many hit points a monster has. I've kind of figured out that Junk Warrior has 3,000 hit points, the manual has the hit points of a few of the main characters' favorite cards, but no other monsters have their hit points listed anywhere. Same goes for the performance buff each monster gives you. Stardust Dragon increases your top speed while it's on the field, Red Dragon Archfiend and Goyo Guardian increase your acceleration, but again, outside of a few of the main characters' key cards, you get no information how monsters affect your runner's performance. You just have to experiment with monsters to figure out who does what, which I guess is kind of good, but also really annoying. For a while I was using Iron Chain Dragon in my deck since he has a good attack range and a really good effect, but whenever I use him, other racers pass me like crazy, so I think the damn thing slows you down while it's on the field. I just find it funny that the game withholds 2 critical pieces of information regarding your monsters, but it tells you how many defense points each monster has when defense points have absolutely nothing to do with the game. When you summon a monster, you get this kick-ass animation of your monster striking a pose while your runner is driven on autopilot for a few seconds. It's called the summoning camera, and if you have any sense at all, you will turn it off. I've lost count of how many times I've summoned a monster, and before the summoning camera wears off, I get nailed from an enemy and the monster gets killed before I even get to use him. I recognize that the game doesn't have great graphics, which doesn't bother me, but because the game doesn't use texture popping or distance fog, the game's frame rate really slows down when you play the multiplayer mode or when you have a Grand Prix race on the stadium course, because the game has to try and render too much at once. But the one gigantic problem that the game has is its physics engine. No matter how good your vehicle's maneuverability is, you turn like you're driving on ice. You pick up speed just fine, but you can't make a single turn without significantly slowing down or sliding into a wall. Pretty much every turn I make in this game consists of me sideswiping a wall and just letting the wall make the turn for me. Speaking of hitting walls, the game has no idea what momentum is. If you sideswipe a wall, you don't slow down at all. You just turn parallel to the surface you hit and you continue at your normal speed. And if you hit an object at a direct enough angle, the game just has you stop dead in your tracks. This gets especially bizarre and massively irritating when a racer in front of you runs out of life points and breaks down, you crash into it, and you come to a complete stop because the game's physics engine treats the stalled motorcycle as a brick wall and it doesn't budge. What's funny is that even though you're on a motorcycle and you should go flying off your bike whenever you have a head-on collision, your character has no animations and is completely motionless on your runner during the entire race. You crash at 50 miles per hour into a wall and your runner just about flips over backwards, and your character is completely motionless. Also, I don't know how to explain it, but when you try to back up, your runner moves and turns really slowly. So if you graze a wall too hard and get turned backward, which happens more often than you'd think, turning around is tremendously difficult. As you play through the game, you unlock the runners of the other main characters to drive during a race. However, if you have any interest in actually winning a race, you'll never use any vehicle other than yours, Yusei's, or Jack's, because all of the other dual runners have terrible performance. What is the point of having a garage full of colorful dual runners if using most of them equates to shooting yourself in the foot? Although it is worth losing a race or two just to drive Greiger's dual runner. This thing is glorious! Sure, it's so big that you have basically no chance of dodging enemy attacks, but man, it's cool. This is something the Batman would drive, if there was a giant bat on it anyway. Seriously, somebody draw this and put it on DeviantArt. Batman driving a motorbike the size of a double-decker bus. I want to see that! But you know what? I'll be the first to admit that this game has problems, including one really big problem, but I love it anyway. Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's Wheelie Breakers is one of the most innovative games that I've seen in a long time. A game that takes an age-old formula, the racing genre, and does something completely new and original with it. But beyond being original, Wheelie Breakers is just a fun game. It's challenging but not overwhelming, it has unlockables to keep you engaged in playing for a long time, and it just has solid core gameplay. It's a good game, and if it had gotten a tuned-up physics engine before getting released, it could have been a great game. But being good is good enough for me.